back, everybody, to another episode of the Dolores Project. Today we have a very special guest, Louis Chude-Sokei, if I'm pronouncing that right. Louis, thank you so much for being on the show.
I'm really grateful for your interest. Thank you for the invitation.
Louis, would you just give us a little bit of background about you, your person, your research, your interests as we get into the show?
Yeah, I'm at that stage in one's career that makes it hard to describe what I do at this point. It's evolved so much. Formerly, I'm a professor of English and the director of the African American and Black Diaspora Studies program at Boston University. My training is as a literary critic, Black Diaspora, looking at the literatures and cultures of the Caribbean, West Africa, African America, Black Europe. And that's the tradition I come from as a scholar in terms of my education, my formal focus professionally. However, this might lead us to some of the broader conversations we're going to have. I've always been a hardcore science fiction nerd, and I've always been involved in music. And working in, reading science fiction and working in music, particularly the aspect of music where you get focused on the knobs and the buttons and the tech and the plugs and all of that, those two things brought me into technology, even before I knew that's what I was doing. So even though my work is in literary and cultural studies, over the last few years, I've just evolved more and more into the space of technology, particularly technology as it emerges from Black interactions with it throughout the entire African diaspora. So in the wake of a book that we'll talk about, The Sound of Culture, I found myself getting even deeper into questions of technology, largely because I started getting invitations to have conversations with people who actually know technology, right? Who are actually interested in everything from engineering to coding to artificial intelligence. And so because I come from music, sound design, and science fiction, I felt I needed to catch up with the real deal stuff on technology. And so that's what I've been doing for the last few years, trying to catch up to the conversations that I've semi-inadvertently fallen into.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a conversation we fall into. It's not something you go looking for. And even in my journey into the question of robots and rights and AI, it wasn't something I was looking for, but something that comes from my past of the military. And so just these
Okay.
weird intersections, but I think that's what's beautiful about it is it brings a lot of different people together around the table to have a conversation. Like,
Absolutely.
yeah, like Lewis, you and I were not tech people, so to speak,
No, we're
you
not.
know, yeah, but we're non-experts in the AI world who are trying to do what everybody's trying to do is just figure out what is right and wrong and how to understand these stories.
I just
And
want to throw one thing in the mix. You just touched on something that I just wanted to squeeze something in here.
yeah,
As we have these conversations with these people, as we stumbled into these conversations, we the stereotypes that we all have of each other, and I don't mean racial or cultural stereotypes, we can talk about that later, but stereotypes we have about engineers,
mm,
tech people, people in the humanities, people in literature, etc. They have such stereotypes of each other that once I started talking to people who are involved in coding and engineering, I'm like, wow, there's an intellectual richness over there. Whereas a lot of my colleagues are likely to go, oh, they're just techies. They don't have any, intellectual pursuits. They're just, codes and zeros and ones or whatever. That is so, so untrue. There's a burgeoning conversation around technology that really is there for a lot of people to get into, but we have such stereotypes of each other and we have such intimidation of the knowledge base that we all represent. It,
yeah,
it's unfortunate.
yeah. And just to give you some background on this project, Lewis, was really disturbing to me was how we not dehumanized each other in a proper sense, but that we had this way of talking about each other on different sides of the fields. I'm like, hey, look, we're all people in this conversation. Like we make up this community and we're so isolated and sometimes even hostile towards, or you're on this side of the spectrum or you're on these sides.
Exactly.
I'm like, we all want the same thing at the end of the day, right? We
Yeah.
want flourishing and peace, hopefully, and
All
provide.
curious.
Yeah, I mean that's what we all want, and I think that's what's so fascinating about this is, I have some people that won't even talk to you and won't even talk about it, but that's their whole life is this research. And I just think it's so fascinating to me. I'm just trying to have broad conversations with people, ask questions, and learn as much as I can. And that's why I'm so grateful for your work because it's so far outside the spectrum of things that I would read and understand and know about just coming from my background. And I think even a lot of people, even in the humanities, might say, I don't know that I've ever really delved into some of this. So, Lewis, could you explain a little bit about the background behind the sound of culture and kind of the key idea and premises in it?
So many ways to answer the question. While doing my formal academic work towards, tenure, etc., that work was really focused more on migration and its relationship to literature and blackface minstrelsy and black performance traditions in the late 19th and early 20th century. But in doing that stuff, I was also writing about or doing research into, early black recording culture, early black recordings of black voices in the 19th century, and early black recording stars. And I found out that what I was really interested in is the very idea of black people encountering this new technology of recording, right? Now, while this is going on, I'm super bored as an academic, as a grad student, as we often are. And so I start writing essays about music. And I'm at the same time I'm playing in bands, never good musician, but always had bad luck with bands, always ended up in terrible bands. But that was very helpful to me because it's a good thing I never actually ended up in a good band because I may never have written The Sound of Culture. I'm writing about music just because it's interesting. I'm writing in, music magazines, and this is pre-internet, so there are no blogs and online sites. But I'm writing in magazines, and the more I write about music, the more I realize that for me, the relationship to sound and music was indistinguishable from my obsession with knobs and buttons and faders and drum machines and synthesizers. And I realized that as an African and Caribbean immigrant to the United States, I grew up in a culture called sound system culture. And sound systems are what give rise to hip hop and electronic dance music and lots of DJ culture. Sound systems are these mobile discotheques that started in the end of colonialism and at the birth of independence in Jamaica. And sound systems, massive speakers, turntables, it's a big deal. But I grew up in a culture where masculinity was really defined not by how big your speakers were, but did you make them yourself? And so I grew up around all of these people obsessed with wires and knobs and volume, etc., and then the studios and sampling and all of that. So it wasn't unique to me to grow up in a context or to feel myself someone who blended the love of music with the love of machines and sonic reproduction, right? And so as I wrote about that music on the side while playing in bad bands and DJing and doing my scholarly work, I wanted to bring them together. And after I'd done some of my formal work and gotten tenure, etc., I was able to really just say, let me write a book that brings together my interest in sound and sound technology, right? And my interest in science fiction and its representations of race and culture and colonialism, right? How can I bring them together? And as I brought them together, it became clear to me that they were kind of always already together. Issue of race and technology precedes sound design, sound system, because the more I did research into science fiction, I realized that, science fiction emerged out of colonial narratives in the 19th century, right? And there was a switch when colonial narratives that were about strange natives and strange traditions in the Upper Zambezi, or all of these exotic narratives about weird outsider, alien, strange creatures. By the late 19th and early 20th century, those very same narratives began to be focused on outer space colonization and strange natives and strange colors of green people, red people, brown people, etc. So seeing the connection between colonial narratives, which is my training in terms of colonialism and literature, and seeing it flipped into sci-fi, which is where otherness and colonization and expansion and race and technology is all there, right? I got super excited, right? So there's this history of race and technology that precedes music and sound systems, etc. And so I just began to do that history. How do we understand the history of race and technology going back to not just colonialism, but industrialization and the slave trade, right? And tell the story from that all the way up to what I didn't plan to do, but you can't continue this narrative without ending up with AI. Especially discovering that, this is something you and many of your listeners all know, but for me, it was mind-blowing to find out that robota and robot comes from coerced labor, right?
Yeah.
To be reading, but also to discover that Karel Capek was writing and very influenced and curious about Jim Crow America, racial segregation, and that found its way into his narratives. To be reading about cybernetics and Norbert Wiener and realizing that Norbert Wiener is writing about race and slavery, right?
Yeah.
And then asking, well, why did the tropes of slavery keep popping up in science fiction and robotics and then AI? And so the sound of culture is me telling the story of me putting all these things together, from industrialism, colonialism, and slavery, all the way up to AI, but also trying to expand the conversation around race and technology, expand it historically.
I think you've done it quite well, Lewis. I mean, really, the book, it was just mind blowing in a lot of ways how you connect them, and in reading your work and Gregory Hampton's work on
Oh, yes.
reimagining slaves.
Yes.
It was just the glass shattering as you go back and watch films like Blade Runner and Metropolis and others. Were like, oh, that should have been a Black person, like that.
Yes.
Like we missed the mark in a lot of ways because that is a part of this story. And when I tell people that, Lewis, who are not familiar with the intertwinedness of race and tech, they're like, you made that up. Like, that's not real. I'm like, no, go back and read the literature, man. Like, actually look into it. It is wild. It is wild because, go ahead.
As someone who is a scholar, right? It's wild. The history, the actual facts and details are mind-blowing, Suddenly you realize that, wow, science fiction is actually tamer than reality.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I wanted to do in that book was to say, look, I'm not making this up. Here is the actual research that brings these things together. Because as I said earlier, they were always together. We just didn't quite realize it.
Right. Yeah. And I think once you see it, you can't not see it, like just permeated throughout the literature. And I think what I need your help with and others is just how to communicate some of these narratives to people who, like even today, just having conversations about large language models and stuff. If they're being forced to do something and would they enjoy it, I'm like, all these conversations we're having, it's basically slavery 2.0.
Yeah.
And we're like, no, Josh, it's not slavery because it's just a machine. I'm like, well, what is that? And how do we break down these dichotomies between person, thing, and object and human? And we don't want to. We don't want to go there. So how do we help people, Lewis, kind of take this step or take the plunge forward?
I'm sure other people have different ways. Like some of my colleagues, the focus on bias and stereotyping and surveillance is a way to get people to take it very seriously. And I think that's true. But it's not also my personality. I'm straight up fanboy, And I think that's another way of getting people to realize that this is worth their time because it's just mind-blowing and interesting, right? We have to find ways to let people realize that everything from the political needs of the conversation to there's also just a passionate, interesting, intellectual thing happening. For example, one of the things that I find remarkable is we are in a time right now, and this is what I've concluded after some time recently. We're at a point now where the world of tech and the world of the humanities are actually obsessed with the same thing. And what is that thing? What is the definition of human? We're now all surrounding that question.
Mm.
And I think that that is a wonderful opportunity to get us into the conversation from all kinds of different angles. Absolutely.
Wow, that's beautiful, man. That is beautiful. I've thought the same thing as a theologian, where we have all this anthropology and literature about these different modes of, this is a human, but I'm like, this touches every piece of the
Yes,
tech conversation, and
absolutely.
I'm like, why not jump into it? It's really interesting, but we have trouble, I think, because of some of our ontologies that we've built, and
True. True.
and I think that's what's, correct me if I'm wrong, some of what you're talking about with the creolization and the merging, and maybe the uncomfortableness with some of the Western mindsets, like we're not sure that we what it means to mingle together.
And that's why it's important to understand how the rest of the world or other people engage the notion of robots and AI. There are those who would suggest that our anxieties are because of a Judeo Christian mindset,
Hmm.
right? Whereas Shintoism and Buddhism have different relationships to objects and the notion that other objects or inanimate objects could also have spirit and life in them.
Yeah.
There are people who are having that conversation, which is quite fascinating, right? But this fear of, and I'll get to creolization in a bit, a lot of this fear might be just a fear of letting go of our centrality. It's akin to the conversations and the arguments we have around the environment, right? Some people would say the reason we don't care enough about the environment is because the environment is too abstract and doesn't look like a person. that which is anthropomorphized gains our sympathy and our guilt, and we can mobilize more around that. I don't know, but there are people who make
Hmm.
that argument. But um, the fear of AI or robots or machines, it's much more potent in the West than other places. And there are those who would suggest that it's because of this white, perhaps, fear of releasing centrality and power, or is it a human fear of not slavery 2.0? What if the fear is not having new slaves, but
Hmm.
having created things that have more power than you? That's something quite different. I don't know that there'd be such fear of algorithms and robots if there was a guarantee that they would just do what we told them to do. The real fear is that they might not.
True.
And you can't have a conversation about slavery without having a conversation about rebellion. That is very much as much a part of slavery as is being docile or complicit.
Hmm.
Actually, you mentioned the creolization piece. You mentioned large language models and just, predictive algorithms all really based on language. Creolization is a way of thinking that
Hmm.
was and is more prominent in the Caribbean and Latin America than in America. It comes out of language,
Hmm.
right? It's understanding that language, the destiny of language is to become something else, is to always be evolving and blending dialect and slang and patois and pidgin, etc. And that's the sign of a healthy language. But creolization then becomes a way of understanding how cultures operate,
Hmm.
right? And so the thinkers that have been most important to my thinking, Edward Blisson, Wilson Harris, you know, and even someone like Sylvia Wynter, although her work isn't explicitly about creolization, these thinkers, in my view, are Black thinkers, or in the case of Wilson Harris, a mix of Black and South Asian. These are thinkers who are less interested in holding on to what we used to be and arguing to defend what we were or trying to go back to what we were. These are theorists and thinkers and writers who have this confidence in just embracing what you're becoming.
Hmm.
And they're the creolization thinkers, the creolists, and there are quite a few of them, Martinique. I'm thinking about, well, there are a number of them that came out of Martinique in the French speaking Caribbean. They were focused less on we are X and we have been robbed of X, and more interested in what have we become and what can we continually become. So creolization is a mode of thinking that is more comfortable with becoming other things than being nostalgic for what one was. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it
And
does.
so for me, I apply that to this, not just racial creolization and the mixing and blurring of identities that happens with migration and all of the different cultures that come together. Doesn't this include our relationship to the environment and to technology? We become creolized by our use of technology. Because as the classic old school Marshall McLuhan angle has it, we create the machines, but they also create us.
Mm.
For me, that is creolization as well. So it's not just about race, gender, sex, and culture, it's also about technology. And so feeling confident and more comfortable with what we're becoming, that's something I feel really connected to, because the alternative is to be afraid of what you're becoming and try your darndest to go back to something you were. And for
Right.
me, that is not a way to go.
I agree. And I think there's some other thinkers who are on the same wavelength. Philip Butler, who is the developer of the Seeker AI, which is,
Oh,
yeah. So this to me too was groundbreaking when I heard him speak, and he was talking about the issue of how to take race out of technology.
yeah,
And Philip's like, no, 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 no. We need to make sure it's reflective of our culture, and trying to make a black AI. I was like, that to me is a beautiful way to reorient the becoming part of it. Is, you're trying to mirror what's already there, and that's what it is, right? This AI or robot, it's a mirroring of what we think we are.
yeah. And, listen, we can talk about Black AI because I did do a project where we created a Black Caribbean algorithm,
Mhm.
and I'll tell you about that in a bit. But here's something that I think about. And I'm actually teaching a class right now, a graduate seminar on race and technology. And we did get to this conversation quite recently about creating a Black algorithm or a Black AI or what that would mean. But my point for the students was, right now, so much of the modeling and the training, right, is geared towards specific kind of information, right? I pose this to the students. If you have an AI that is aware and informed enough about the world we live in, that algorithm, that system is going to not just reflect biases and racism and sexism. At some point, it's also going to school itself in Edward Glissant. It's going to also read bell hooks. It's also, what if we start training them and informing them with this sort of counter narratives of,
Hmm.
racism and sexism, etc. Right? Would that make a difference, or is that inevitable? And so I'm interested in that as well. What if at some point algorithms and these large language models become more curated, shall we say?
Hmm.
Will that create a difference? Well, if you believe in creolization as a product of language that transforms culture, well then, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so. And I think I'm less afraid of that, what that might become, once I, like you said, kind of broaden out my moral circle. Once I've allowed myself to say that this story is not just about me,
Yes.
but about the environment, about the animals that sustain it. Because I like to tell people, humans are the only animals that can't sustain themselves. We
Huh,
we rely on everything else
that's
in this
right.
create ecosystem to sustain us, and I think to not treat it that way with its proper respect gives us this false sense of pride and hubris. I think also it even affects how we posture towards one another.
I
And
agree.
even with slavery, right? It doesn't just hurt the person who is held captive; it hurts the slaver too.
Absolutely.
And so you have to see the both and of it. And I think sometimes we're only seeing one side of it. And I think conversations like this, and with your work, and others who are thinking about what this means from a different perspective. So like I love the music, uh, like lens that you kind of look at it, and even have a playlist to go along, which I'll link to it below. That's related to the sound of culture, and just very very different. The thing I love about it, even with little kids, like we have three, you can play music, right? They have no taste for any type of genre. You play music and it has
Do
drums
that.
and beats. It's just they just start, the body moves to it, right? And so there's something something beautiful about that. And as music, it just kind of connects people who wouldn't naturally be together. And I think
Whereas,
AI and robots is the same way.
say, I agreed. I mean, one of the things about this music in the playlist is that a lot of it is stuff that I talk about or allude to in the book, or allude to similar things that the music contains. And the playlist goes all the way to the early 20th century, all the way up to electronic music. Why is that important? Well, I was pointing out that in Black music, there is a conversation about robots and technology that goes all the way back to Duke Ellington and beyond, right? They're singing about flying saucers, and there's Trinidadian calypso songs from the 1950s about Sputnik, and there's all this interesting stuff. And if you look at album covers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, everything is outer space and magical. And so I took that seriously, that, these folks may not have been necessarily writing a lot of sci-fi or being involved in actual engineering other than music engineering and sound engineering. But for them, it was a conduit and an access point to get into technology as a conversation, as a cultural conversation, right? So that's why the playlist is there, and why music really matters to this context. Answer to a question you asked a moment ago, it's also the case that it's possible to get younger people involved in questions of engineering and coding and technology, particularly Black and brown young kids, through music, right? What if, and this is another thing that really oriented me around the work that led to the Sound of Culture, what if we looked at what young Black and brown kids are doing in shanty towns in South Africa and Jamaica, in projects in Brooklyn, tower block estates outside of London? What if we stop thinking of it as cool music? Because no one's going to critique the notion that Black people are making cool music. That's like the biggest cliche of all time. What if we just said it's not cool music, it's programming, it's coding, it's sampling, it's some sound design, etc. Because it is. That's exactly what it is. The kind of inventiveness that is there in the electronic and music world in people's basements and bedrooms is stunning, right? So what if that becomes a bridge to coding and technology? What if they realize that, oh, I'm actually coding. This is not music per se. I'm hoping that opening up the conversation that way will then impact the question of inequality and access and bias and stereotypes once we have a broader group of people who feel like, yo, I started out as a DJ, I'm now working at Google, right?
That'd be awesome, yeah.
I don't think that's impossible to see.
No, not at all. It's really not. And I think the way that things are now today, with all these different academies and just kind of like stuff you can do online, you can teach yourself code in a lot of different ways, and
Absolutely.
that is to me the beauty, how it levels out, where there's so many different I'm in Mississippi, and so there's so many different digital divides, and certain people, like there's people here that don't have the internet just because of how the state is laid out. But man, there's a level ground here, I think, for people to learn some of these things and empower themselves in a way that a couple of generations ago didn't quite have access to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's
And
been a big shift.
yeah, and so we want to get on the forefront of that and create pipelines. So like, hey, like how do we get into schools and help, kids that are like, I love what you're connecting there with music, because that is a good way to get people interested in it. And there's nobody who doesn't like music, right? Except maybe my wife. She was the one person I knew. I'm like, what are you listening to? She's like, nothing.
Such people exist. I've met a
Yes.
few. I've met a
Right?
few.
Yeah. I'm like, music is life, man. I have a soundtrack playing all the time, and so that's a different conversation. But yeah, how do we get people to jump into this pipeline? I think maybe Lewis, you're onto a lot of different things, but I think that's definitely a way that especially non-experts can help people connect.
And to know that they're already, I mean, the thing about technology, you know this very well. The thing about technology is that there's none of us that are not involved in it.
Right. Yeah.
We're not thinking about it, but we're very involved in the conversation, or sorry, we're involved in the use and consumption and expansion. what you're really asking is, how do we get people to be more mindful and aware of the fact that they are in the conversation already?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Louis, let me ask you I'm just curious, your opinion on what narratives are, what stories, either in sci-fi, it could be books, it could be film. What are some stories that get the questions wrong? And then what are some stories, your favorite stories, get the questions right?
So you mean general narratives, not like specific titles?
Yeah, I mean, whatever you want to discuss.
I think any narrative that suggests that Black people or people of color are alienated from, distanced from, uninterested in technology is abundantly wrong.
Yeah.
Abundantly wrong. And those narratives don't just come from white people. They also come from Black people who just assume that technology is raced as white, etc. I don't believe that that is true at all. The idea that another narrative, that technology belongs to white corporate elite, as a person who comes out of music, the amount of tech that was initially meant to be for white men, etc., and within a few years became restructured, reinvented, pirated, and remade by people in Jamaica, South Africa, Brooklyn, what have you, should remind us that technology is not just its own story. The story of technology is also written by people who were not intended for its use. Piracy is as part of the technology story, right? People using it in ways that were completely unexpected, that's a part of the story. So the story is already blended and creolized, So the stories that suggest that somehow it belongs to this group and is meant to be used a certain way, that's not the history that you and I experience, right? It may start out there, but it becomes something entirely different and expanded in a completely different way. I will not be surprised if and when AI is something that can be bootlegged. Right?
Yeah.
And people, we already are afraid of deep fakes and all of that. At a certain point, all of these texts are going to be accessible, whether we like it or not, by all kinds of actors. Right?
Yeah.
That's a part of the history of technology.
Mm.
And so for me, any narrative that suggests that technology is its own story or the story that it tells, that gets it wrong.
Yeah.
That gets it wrong.
Yeah, I like what you said about bootlegging. It made me think about the movie Chappie.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like that's totally the embodiment of what you're saying, and I love that film. I think that's when I think about tech and narratives, I think it's always going to kind of go that way. We have one kind of intended design, and
Exactly.
it's always malleable to something else. And
Absolutely.
the same way with music, right? And so there's
And
just
same way with culture.
yeah, it's strange. Like we get so what we were talking about earlier, just kind of pigeonholed into these certain ideas about what you're like or what this person is like based on how their looks or their phenotype, whatever. And that really doesn't tell us much about that person, right? I
No,
mean, it tells us some things, but I think even with AI and robots, what would their person be like if we get to that stage or whatever? I know there's lots of different opinions about that, but I do believe we'll get to a point where it'll be harder and harder to tell as far as like personality wise, and I think that'll be interesting to see. Kind
I
of,
will agree with you, but here's what I'll say: that before we get to that point, we're going to reach a point where whether they have personality at all or not, it will not matter, because human beings have this thing
yeah,
where we will treat you and respond to you as a creature, as a human being, simply because you look like one.
yeah,
And you act in some way like one, right? So before we get to a point, if we ever get to a point of sentience, I don't have that conversation. I'm not really equipped.
yeah,
That's beyond my pay grade. Sentience. But regardless of that, we're going to start attributing it to machines and algorithms in intimate ways, affectionate ways, political ways. We've already started that. That's already started.
yeah,
And for me, and this is really the theme of the new book I'm writing, old others condition how we understand new others.
And I think I want to ask you a little bit more about that, if you're open to share. Like when you talk about new others, what would that look like? And you know what I mean? Like I think I know where you're going, and so when I talk to people about even the possibility of granting some type of moral consideration for an entity, like you're saying, because we do anthropomorphize things, our
Yes,
cars, but it's a little bit different because I think that it's a part of our programming, so to speak. That's a good thing. It's not a bug to be fixed, but
it's empathy. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
it's
sympathy.
good. That means you're working properly
Yeah.
if you feel bad about it, right? Like you said you're sorry, and that's a good thing. But why do we stop there when okay, now it's a machine, but I know I've got all these dichotomies set up in my mind, and then we're fighting it in a way. And what happens when we take that next step, like you're talking about with new others?
Yeah. The- I I don't know how to answer the what happens when we do that, but I think I'm more focused on how do we get to that point, right? And I think that because old others condition how we relate to new others, race, gender, class, immigration, all these things are the thing that we have to get past to do that, right? Because to anthropomorphize is to also to racialize, to also gender, right? And so, you know, in order for us to take the step that you're describing, we have to get through the race, gender, sex, class, all that stuff before we move forward. As you know, there are people even having conversations about the color of industrial robots, white ones versus black ones. They've done tests,
Hmm.
and people respond differently to the white ones versus the black ones. And so, even though these things aren't even anthropomorphized, like the Boston Dynamics robot dogs and things like that, we're already confronting how we project race, gender, sex, whatever onto machines. And in order to imagine that next step you're describing, we have to imagine a primary step to get us through this historical baggage.
Do you have any guidance for us?
I think that the best way for us to navigate this is to not navigate it alone.
Hmm.
What I mean by that is we all have to be in the conversation. All communities, cultures, races, genders, etc., all have to be stakeholders in the conversation and feel enough a part of it to care enough to care about it. I think right now, for a lot of people, technology is owned by Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. And that's why I think there's so much hostility to a lot of conversations about tech. It's just because people feel like it's
Hmm.
alienated from them. And so things that you feel that are not yours or alien to you, you can be hostile and suspicious, right? I think if everyone felt like, well, this conversation about AI, robots, algorithms, etc., is not just corporate, military industrial complex, etc., but more intimate stuff that we can care about, I think we'd have a hopefully richer conversation. And that's how my politics are in general. We just need more people in the conversation to work out a way forward.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard though. There's those who desire conversation and dialogue, and then there are those who do not desire conversation at all.
Yeah, especially right now. I get it.
But man, I think that it's wonderful, to sit back and maybe there's another piece to it where maybe there's a new movement around music. Like I was just thinking about we create these machines or historically have created them to take over labor and stuff like that. But it seems to be like they also have a lot of creative sides to them. They have a lot of artistic sides to them that maybe they don't want to build stuff for us. They don't want to, build small microchips that they want to paint and create and do these different things. And it says that a lot about just the nature of being. And as we think about hands versus the mind, and that's how I'm beginning to think differently about AI and robotics. It's not so much what's in the mind, but what's its hand gonna make if it has a hand. But
Or
yeah,
I mean, you're asking, what if they are not just tools for our purposes, but capable of abstraction or allowed to just, what if we stop asking ChatGPT specific questions and try to figure out ways for it to generate its own abstractions? That could be interesting.
Yeah, that's what I'm interested in, but I'm an abstract thinker. But that's okay.
I did an album last year with a really well-known German electronic group, and we created an algorithm, and the algorithm was sort of trained on Caribbean thinkers and poets, etc. And one of the things that happened on the album is that the one of the rules was we're not going to fix the algorithm.
Hmm.
Whatever it generates, we will play with that, and it will then take our input and respond in its own way, and we won't consider it errors, even if it breaks from melody, breaks from pitch. Just we adjust to it as if it is a member of the band.
Wow.
And that was a really interesting experiment. The album is called Anarchic Artificial Intelligence. It came out in 2021, and it's the group is called Mouse on Mars.
I'll link to it below.
Yeah, and it's a collaboration with me because the algorithm also trained on my voice, and so it starts out, blurbling and how they start, but they kept that in the album so that as the algorithm learned how to speak, that would be part of the musical back and forth with the musicians. And by the end of the album, I've had people walk up to me and say, "Wow, you're great on that album. Your voice is wonderful." I'm like, that wasn't me.
Yeah, that's
That
wild,
wasn't
man.
me. But it was an experiment with AI to see what if we tried to have an AI in the band rather than telling it what to do. And that whole album is basically a product of the AI being a member of the band.
That's so cool. I'm gonna go listen to that tonight. That is
It's
amazing.
pretty trippy. Make sure
Yeah.
you listen to the whole thing though, because it starts out all noisy and it takes shape because that's how the AI learned.
Well, that's part of the story, right? I mean,
Yes.
every album, you don't just listen to your favorite songs. If you really want to listen to it, this is why I like cassette tapes. As terrible as they sound, it's just you have to go on a journey
I'm
with
with
it.
you. Listen,
Yeah.
I'm a vinyl guy.
Okay.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah. You got to go through a process with it, and I think even becoming humanist is that process of developing. And I think even in my own philosophy, you can see people who become more and who can become less, right? Now, I don't have the ability to make someone less. That's not what I'm saying. But,
Yeah,
we can act in a way, cruelty and dehumanization. I
of
mean,
course.
it makes us animal like, is what I'm saying. So I think there are these two pathways or multiple pathways where if we're not careful, we're unbecoming and not becoming. And so,
You've answered the tough question you asked me about making suggestions and moving forward. Your answer earlier, which you've just repeated, is, slavery doesn't just hurt the enslaved, it deforms the master as well, right? So what you're just describing is part of what we have to do is be aware of the fact of how we're treating the other, right? And how that reflects back on us and deforms us. I think that matters with technology too. I'm not someone who is really committed to the idea that, oh, machines are going to become human or what have you. I don't know about all. Again, beyond my pay grade. I'm really interested in what do we become in this process.
yeah.
And that's what I'm interested in.
So, you have any particular opinions about when we cross that threshold? Are you open to um like I think some people think it's going to be like a big robot revolution where, and I don't see it that way. It's artificial slaves or servants. That's been in the mind since Aristotle. I mean,
Yes,
long
yes, indeed.
before. But I don't feel right saying, "Hey, let's make a slave." I don't feel right about that. That doesn't sound right. It's not a good thing to desire to make a slave. But I want to make technology. I want to make robots, and I want to make AIs. And I don't quite see that as the same if it has a certain point where I say, "Okay, here you could be free." Like there's a point where I'm not gonna like you don't respond to me anymore. I'm not the creator master. Like, how do you feel about that, Lewis? Like, what?
It's funny. In the class, the grad seminar I'm teaching, we were reading some roboticists, and I didn't realize that there's a whole tradition. Well, maybe tradition is too big a term, but there are a bunch of people who believe, hey, Joshua, just get over it. Just
Yeah.
make them slaves, and once you consider them slaves, there's no ambiguity and there's no problem.
Yeah.
Or there are those who would say, just make them not look human, and it'll be okay. If they look like weird machine things, we won't have empathy, we won't care. I don't fully believe that, but I get it.
Mm.
My response is, so much of the conversations about robotics and AI and algorithms sees them as other things, as others, right? I'm no Ray Kurzweil, and I'm no transhumanist, but the truth is, the future is more biotech than anything else.
Yeah.
These things are not going to be other to us. They're going to be in us, blended, creolized. So I think about that. The fear of the robot, the uprising or the difference or what have you, that's because we're still thinking of them as being strange things distant from who and what we are and therefore threatening. What if, in fact, it's all about brain-computer implants, BCIs, right? What if it's all about going from, pacemakers and all of these things, and our cell phones, we're already blended with these machines. It'll just become more and more normal.
Yeah.
And so at that point, it'll be hard to see them as a threatening other when we are them too.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope so. I hope so.
You said, I hope so. There are other people who are hearing me going, that's horrific.
Yes. I know, pulling their hair out. And like you said, there are people who've written robots should be slaves. And I'm just, as a Southerner, I'm just like, oh man, please don't ever say that, and like I know people who went through Jim Crow. Like
Yeah.
it's just wild to me. But like you're saying, we take medicine. So it's not that when we cross the threshold, we're already cyborgs in a way.
Exactly.
It's just, I think this is what this book is so wonderful to help people think through, and I just highly recommend it. I can't get over it, Lewis. I really can't.
Oh, I'm
And
grateful.
yeah, it's just
Well, I'll give you a little tip, advance notice. The book I'm writing now takes a lot of that research, but it's telling it as a conversational story.
oh wow.
So it's really being written for people who, literary work. I don't mean fiction, it's nonfiction, but it tells a lot of the stories and uses a lot of that research to tell the story of how, old others condition our relationship to new others.
Yes.
But in a way that is super accessible and more literary. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Awesome. I cannot wait. Wait to promote that. That is amazing.
I can't wait to finish it.
Yeah, I'll keep you in my thoughts and prayers, man, as you work towards that goal, and you can be sure to let us know so we can promote the book and link to it. But thank you so much for your time tonight, and I'm grateful for your scholarship, just the rhythm of how you communicate things in your writing, and just the heart, and it's just wonderful. I'm such a huge fanboy, and so I'm happy. But
I'm super grateful for your interest and support. That's why I was happy to come and chat with you. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you.
and I want to get your message out there as much as I can. I'm a nobody in this world, but if I can encourage a couple other scholars to read your work and jump in, and it's there. It's on people's minds. It's on the tip of their tongue. They just maybe haven't found the right set of music to connect it to, the right soundtrack. There we go.
Yeah.
And then I think too, with your next book, that'll connect on an even wider level with the lay audience. As once I say it, like once we put it into the air, people have this initial reaction, but then once they hear and let it kind of set in the crock pot a little bit, like okay, I see where you're going with this.
Exactly. That's the thing about creolization and these ideas. It's always fascinating to the moment when you realize that it's always been this way. It's new to you, so you think it's new, but then you stop for a moment and you realize, oh no, I'm just now realizing that this has always been this way. And that's what I'm trying to do, is let people know that this is not alien, strange ideas. this stuff is, as you said, it's been in the crock pot for a long time.
Yeah. Well, Lewis, thank you so much for your time. Tell us how we can get in contact with you or find your work if we're interested.
One of the good things about having a name like I do, Chude-Sokei, is that if you Google it, there's a lot of things that'll come up. Essays and articles. I'm also always happy to, respond to emails with links and information to the articles and essays. Lots of stuff on YouTube and videos. The Anarchic Artificial Intelligence album is out there. I did a memoir that came out last year that sort of tells the story as an immigrant and how these things
Hmm.
came to make sense to me. I have a Facebook page and I'm also on Instagram. So please, I welcome the conversation as long as it's fun and joyful and productive.
Absolutely. Well, Lewis, it has been fun, productive, and joyful. I can guarantee that. So thank you so much.
All right, Joshua, thank you so much.